Before we begin today, I would like to introduce myself. My name is Annie Wong, and I am the Curator of Public Engagement and Programming at Gallery TPW. And I would like to take a moment first to acknowledge that the land that we are on, we occupy the territories of the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat people, now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis. Toronto is part of Treaty 13 territory and the Dish with One Spoon Covenant, which reminds us that we all share the same bowl and spoon, and therefore we must take only what we need and leave some for others. This territorial acknowledgement is a preliminary step towards a deeper process of understanding settler subjectivity and the colonial fabric of Canadian society. Through ongoing and sustained inquiry, as a settler, artist, and arts worker, myself and Gallery TPW are committed to the process of learning and unlearning that leads us towards being in right relations with First Nations communities and the land. I am so excited to have 𝓌𝒽𝒻𝒻 Fokianaki be part of this symposium on care. She's prepared a very special lecture for us today. And I came across 𝓌𝒽𝒻𝒻's long-form research project, the Bureau of Care, in 2020. And a lot of the ideas that she presented there really helped shape the trajectory of the symposium, but also in my thinking coming into this role at Gallery TPW at that time. In her introductory notes, 𝓌𝒽𝒻𝒻 makes the very bold statement, we must move from institutional critique to institutional transformation. This call to action echoes deeply in the Canadian context, as we have learned from our opening programs on Tuesday with Richard, Andrea, and Amy and Zainab, who discussed the criticism and activisms of artists advocating for systemic change in the 80s that has landed us in a problematic neoliberal context in which multiculturalism functions as race management and equity policy continues to benefit the white majority. Similarity, yesterday, our conversations with Richard, Julia, and Sherry Austin of Gifts for Two-Spirit Youth discuss the ways in which micro-relations and grassroots initiatives operate to work in and out of institutions to create spaces of care for and by the community. And so to confront 𝓌𝒽𝒻𝒻's statement in 2020 in Across Seas demonstrates a global need to heed this call for this ongoing work. And so I'm incredibly excited and delighted to have 𝓌𝒽𝒻𝒻 speak today so that we may share these transnational learnings. 𝓌𝒽𝒻𝒻 Fokianaki is a curator, researcher, and theorist based in Athens and Rotterdam. Her curatorial interests focus on the manifold manifestations of power and the ways they can be examined by contemporary culture, looking specifically at the influence of geopolitics, national identity, and cultural and anthropological histories. Founder of the research platform, the Bureau of Care, which received the European Cultural Foundation Solidarity Grant in 2020, 𝓌𝒽𝒻𝒻 looks to the concept of care and how its politics and ethics are related to environmental and social justice. 𝓌𝒽𝒻𝒻 is also the founder and director of State of Concept Athens since 2023. A change maker in the Athenian art scene, her exhibitions include artists such as Basmin Magdi, forensic architecture, 𝒸𝒶𝓉, Metahaven, and many others. She has also curated exhibitions for international institutions such as eFlux New York, La Colonie, Cadas Paris, Kunst International, Meli Rotterdam, and many others. She was the curator of the Survival Kit 13 at the Latvian Center for Contemporary Arts. She's currently working on a group exhibition for Reina Sofia Museum Madrid and a group show at the Framer Framed Amsterdam. Both projects are to be realized in 2023. I'm going to curtail this bio, and I invite everyone to visit our website for an extended and full bio of 𝓌𝒽𝒻𝒻. In this lecture, 𝓌𝒽𝒻𝒻 will investigate the range of politics around care and discuss care and reproduction labor in the wake of ecological catastrophe. Further in this trajectory, her lecture will hone in on care as an institutional practice and as how to bring careful practices into arts institutions. Thank you so much, 𝓌𝒽𝒻𝒻. I pass it on to you.
Thank you very much, Annie. I'm very, very happy to participate in this wonderful 5 days. I'm very sorry that I'm not physically there. It was a little bit impossible, and it's related to care labor on my part, and specifically the fact that I have a very, very young baby. I just recently came back from Spain, so I couldn't leave again. As Annie mentioned, we've opened up a very big exhibition at the National Museum of Contemporary Art of Spain, the 𝒸𝒶𝓉, discussing the concept of machinations, which is for another lecture. I'm not going to analyze or discuss this at all today. I'm very, very happy always to participate in meetings that are discussing the concept of care, because I really feel that I mean, having looked and researched on care these last 4 years, you know, in the beginning it was kind of I was kind of thinking that this is going to be a one-time project, that we will open the Bureau of Care, we will discuss a few things, we will produce a book, and that's that. But very quickly on, I realized that we're not discussing about something that is a subject matter that can be addressed in a few meetings or a few writings, but it's basically a shift in the way that we understand how we work. And I think it's important that we talk about care as much as possible, actually, especially when it comes to our field, because our field is maybe, I would say, the most successful guinea pig in terms of how neoliberal policies of disaster capitalism are applied. So it's quite important to create, let's say, frontiers or barriers to protect ourselves from exhaustion, from self-exploitation, from exploitation of others, and from you know, careless, let's say, structures. Just to say, as I mentioned, and I would like to begin here, I started discussing the concept of care. I started thinking about it a little bit before the COVID pandemic, mainly because I was seeing a few institutions starting to kind of thinking of maybe, I would say it was more the words used were not care so much, it was more repair. Of course, because there was a lot of discussion in relationship to reparative instituting, reparative politics, reparations in relationship to colonial violence and injustices that have been occurring for decades and eons. And naturally, it was a subject matter that was interesting for me, given the fact that, of course, also Greece is one of the countries that have been looted, and there are still hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of artifacts that are all over, you know, the global North's museums, and have not been returned. But it was interesting that the conversation started before COVID in relationship to care more as repair. And I think the COVID pandemic really brought to the fore conversations on the subject of care and the realities that we face with various different gradings and forms of collapse of our care systems. What is interesting is 3 years later, and with many wars, but also one specific war that has really affected the finances of you know, what we know as the Western world, and specifically the US and Europe, and I would say Canada is also affected. This is interesting because you see a new financial crisis that is looming now, where we say, and we see that care structures that were, let's say, temporarily fortified due to the pandemic are now being recalled and kind of taken back. And together with these, I mean, I'm saying care structures, and of course, most of us will probably think we're talking about welfare states and healthcare. But in fact, also anything that is related to culture falls into that category. And I think that's quite important to start thinking, because for us also that are of a generation of the 80s, we kind of still remember the crisis in the mid 2000s, in 2006 and 7, and how there was a lot of financial cuts in culture. cuts that I would say almost 15 years to 20 years later, we have yet to recover from. And I think that this is quite interesting in terms of looking at care, let's say, in the agenda of the state, and looking at care as well as a policy in relationship to contemporary art and culture at large. Let me just share my screen here. So in a recent review that I've been kind of like a junkie when care comes up in any article. I'm basically trying to read everything that there's out. This is an article from The Economist. I always read The Economist, and friends tell me, "Why on earth are you reading neoliberal magazines?" And I always tell them, we need to know what the enemy is talking about. We need to read these things. So The Economist, of course, is like, the epitome of neoliberal conservative politics. And there is this article that really was fascinating for me. It says, the surtitle, the smaller, it says "Financing Economics, ouch. Why healthcare services are in chaos everywhere." This is from January 2023. And the subtitle is, or the smaller title, the undertitle is, "Now is an especially bad time to suffer a heart attack." I mean, the fact that, I was kind of visualizing these like white, straight, middle-aged men writing this article. Of course, The Economist is also famous of never having writers. They're never signed, these articles. They are from The Economist, as if it's like, a superpower of white men that are, moving the puppets of the world. So I was thinking how ironic and how cynical it is to actually make a joke and laugh about the fact that even after 3 years of a pandemic, where supposedly governments tried to make a healthcare system and a care structure that is more fortified and better, now, of course, because of lack of staff, because of lack of money, because of 1,000 reasons that are analyzed in the article, it's a very bad time to have a heart attack. So, you better have money, because if you don't, you can't have a heart attack. So, I mean, it kind of showed, I think, the complete and total collapse of the welfare state care system. And of course, this is a care system that some countries have the privilege to have and others don't. And I think it's not related only in, let's say, a Western or non-Western or a so-called first world economy or not. It's really a mentality of how the state understands the welfare state, and how it understands the care structures. I mean, the US, I think, is a very classical example of all aspects of state care structures being privatized, if not all, maybe 99%. And the more private and exclusive, the better quality they have. And thus, if they're public and if they're free, they're not of great quality. So it seems that the more advanced the capitalist system, generally the various forms of care provided by the welfare state model have been dismantled. So healthcare, especially for the disenfranchised, the poor and the unemployed, care of the mentally and physically differently abled, the elderly, victims of domestic abuse, and so on. And on a more conceptual level, the care provided by social justice and climate justice, I would say, in a second wave, intersectional alliances, collective rights, and environmental justice, yes, as I said, are also sidelined. So the more we move towards a neoliberal model of disaster capitalism, and I'm using Naomi Klein's terminology of disaster capitalism here. And what I mean by that is not simply to live in a country where this is exercised, but also to be in the mentality of disaster capitalism. And I'm saying that as a subjectivity from the global South, which is the worst case scenario of the European South, let's say, where we have a country that has been very poor. We have now a neoliberal government that is talking about growth, and growth for them is privatization of all healthcare systems and complete disarray and dismantling of any Natura zones of where species, very, very important species that have been protected are being basically murdered and thrown away. So it's the mentality of disaster capitalism, not necessarily that you belong to a first world or a so-called first gear economy. So this mentality, it makes us understand care as a transaction. So even if it includes care label that is for within our immediate kin, again, it is, oh, I can do this for my child because I cannot do this, or I have to work for this and someone else will do this for my child, etc., or my mother, or XXX. So however, with a bit of research, we also see that this individualism, I have discussed about this kind of collectivism versus individualism in previous texts, so I'm not going to analyze it here. But although it is indeed very much connected to capitalism, it's not necessarily at all societies that it permeates the whole structure of living. And let's say new capitalist centers, such as Japan, for instance, appear to be developing without individualistic values expanding, and institutions remain in, let's say, what we can call collectivist norms. Again, I'll put that in quotation marks. So in conclusion, it can be argued that the relationship between individualism and capitalism and disaster capitalism, I say, is contingent and variable. I mean, of course, we observe that even more when we're discussing concepts such as self-care, since, of course, by leaning in, and here I'm using this term of leaning in because it's a famous book by this former CEO or SFO of Facebook, which kind of represents white liberal feminism par excellence, I would say. So by leaning in and taking care of oneself, of course, contemporary subjectivities of the so-called developed world are tasked with the care of their overworked bodies or, immediate family, but are less and less interested in the well-being of bodies that are outside of their class, of their workplace, of their city, of their country, etc., etc. One example that I have very recent is the way the apathy in which we have dealt with in relationship to this refugee boat that sunk in Greece only a week and a half ago, I think it was, where more than 650 people lost their lives. And there was not even a discussion in relationship to whether there would be care structures, again, I will say here, that could at least, retrieve the bodies of these people that lost their lives. So with such horrible conditions, but again, 3 multi-billionaires that were visiting, just for fun, the Titanic wreckage somewhere in the middle of of the sea, were actually found and were recovered. And it's very interesting to see, such a cynical difference in the way that 2 incidents are and deaths, the deaths of 3 people versus the deaths of 650 people. So we do have a further, let's say, responsibility for our own care, but care has lost its character as a human right, and now it's understood more and more as a paid service. And this is something that we really need to think about also in relationship to the way that we institute, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. So through a complete disregard for the politics and ethics of care, and through a strategic and premeditated effort to quell any possibility for people to gather, discuss, organize, and effectively resist what T.J. Demos calls our defuturing, disaster capitalism is the embodiment of careless living. I mean, for me, we are basically entering a realm of, we can say, careless capitalism somehow. So as a counteraction or counterpower, if we would like to use Gramscian terms here, I've been looking these last years into typologies of care practiced by those who decide to live and organize themselves otherwise, and who pave the way for imagining and practicing alternative forms of collective caring. This is a slide from Pirate Care, which is a collective that has been really, I mean, fascinating to me. I would really suggest that you visit their website and look at the fantastic work that they have been doing. Apart from writing a lot of texts and collective texts in relationship to care and its politics and ethics, they have also been organizing together with activists from various fronts. They have been making, let's say, a little bit more kind of studies in relationship to healthcare systems, and they have been really addressing care as a political positioning, which I find very interesting. So just to break down what I will be discussing, I mean, as Annie mentioned, care and reproductive labor today and how we might think of it, of course, in the age of climate catastrophe. And secondly, I would try to link that with care labor as an institutional practice. I hope that we will have the time for it, because I'm known to make longer lectures. But there we go. So given the general decline of care and the propagation of care as an individual and solitary act, care and its labor have been systematically undervalued for much longer than these last years. Patriarchal societies, not only white and Western ones, patriarchal societies at large, especially since the 17th century, have made sure that all forms of labor that are linked with care are widely identified with women and their supposed innate desire to care for their families, right? Despite the feminist revolution, of course, of the 70s, this belief remains strong today. And we see kind of these reenactments of these tea parties and this Phyllis Schlafly conservative women. And I think, again, you know, from the beginning of my research into care in 2020, now we have, you know, Roe versus Wade reversed in the United States. We have a lot of countries in the European Union that are changing their legislation in relationship to abortion rights, all extremely problematic, you know, examples of really an authoritarian, I would say, very conservative turn in relationship to femininities. And I think what is happening here is a burdening of femininities with newly allocated obligations, I'm putting it in quotation marks, in relationship to care labor, and new restrictions as well in relationship to how we own, let's say, our own bodies and how we can do and what we can do with them. So in this framework, care labor has been treated as a gender responsibility following from natural behavior. And here, please, I would like us to think also of the concept of nature as female, as well as what many refer to a woman's nature. You know, these all conservative discussions include terminology like that and perpetuate this type of terminology. So the feminization of nature as well, and then the naturalization of a certain femininity specifically are linked also for me. Now, from the second wave of feminism to today, of course, feminist theories like from Shulamith Firestone to Silvia Federici to Delphi to many have highlighted the link between care in the household and productivity in the marketplace. And here it's interesting to really think especially of the commodification of these ideas. And some 40 years later, and with the clarity provided by a global pandemic in turbo-capitalist times, it's even more evident that care labor, whether paid or unpaid, remains feminized. And of course, when paid, it's associated with very low wages and poor working conditions, as Encarnación Guterres and Federici as well have mentioned. But the class here performs this work is the epitome of precarious and is made up overwhelmingly of women. Of course, the 3 years of COVID showed us that it's not just women. Because of course we had all these like you know from funeral home assistants, to delivery people, to educators, but even though it was not solely women, it was a feminized idea of these types of labor that remains, and we still have. So when it comes to unpaid care labor, the legacies of feminist struggles, mainly in so-called first world economies, are evident in neoliberal state policies that recognize the monetary value of care work through benefits for non-working parents, of course, and caretakers, although in recent decades, I would say that these have also diminished. And I think that's interesting to see also in relationship to the art world and how unfriendly, the field is in relationship to families, family leave, residencies that are related to families. I have so many artist mothers that are basically constantly telling me, but I cannot go to this residency, or I cannot apply for this thing because they specifically state, we do not accommodate families, we do not accommodate you and your partner or your children. So I recommend an essay also that has been written by three German scholars called Care Economies, Feminist Contributions and Debates in Economic Theory. They really discuss many fields, including the art field as well. So unpaid and paid care labor and the way that they are valorized have in recent decades been discussed through a new chapter, and that is of reproductive labor. And that is quite interesting for me also when we're really discussing and looking at it through, classic Marxist economic theory in relationship to surplus value. So there is a new form of reward in relationship to reproductive labor that I'm interested in, and it's inserted into this concept of surplus value, as I said, and it's equally underpaid, as I discussed. And it's funny to see it because generally it is looked at as very well paid, but if you really look at it, it's very underpaid. And what I mean here, there are two aspects that I would like to bring to the fore that are related to reproductive labor of women. So as women from first world economies have entered the waged workforce, their formerly unwaged labor has been passed on to predominantly migrant women from so-called second and third world economies who face low pay and precarious working conditions, often living in uncertainty with 0-hour contracts, flex working, what in Greece we call black money, which is money that, there is no receipt, there is no social insurance, there is nothing. So migration and the feminization of labor are inextricably connected. So are the burden of care labor, its low monetary value, and its close relationship to inequality. So the need for a fundamental restructuring of care and care work, and again, I will apply this, I'm always thinking through the museum as well, as art workers, as people that work in institutions, we always need to think, who are we employing? Who are the people that are cleaning our museums? What kind of conditions are they working in? Who are those that are doing unpaid or 0-hour contract jobs that are related to security or are related to invigilation or till work or. So the critique, we can critique, of course, neoliberal policies and disaster capitalism, while we can promote a feminist commons, a redistribution of power, social justice, and ecological consciousness. So, and this is let's say the ideal that we would go for in the need for fundamental restructuring of care and care work. So I would like to focus on a very specific aspect of reproductive labor, and that is the process of assisted reproduction through IVF. Now, in many European countries, I'm not sure what is the legislative. I didn't have the time. In fact, I'm admitting to research Canada, but I'm hoping that we can have this discussion at the end. So the process of assisted reproduction through IVF in many European countries, egg donation, and which is fact is not a donation, of course, because it's selling human tissue, is primarily provided by young women of migrant or minority background. The production of oocytes, which is basically the eggs, is now a business that helps the bigger business of IVF. Now, if we would like to think of care, or at least I would like to, as caring for justice as well, which is another kind of recurring theme in both my exhibitions and also my writing, then caring for reproductive justice is very important. So I'm attempting here to look at the issue from the perspective of those that provide the value chain of reproduction and benefit less than everyone from it. Academic ethnographic research, for instance, conducted in Spain, there is no such research in Greece, so I went to the immediate kind of neighboring European South paradigm, shows the pattern of cross-border reproduction. Selling one's oocytes is a way for migrant women to gain money. It is work that is underpaid, and given it's underpaid, I mean, a lot of people say, you know, one woman can go through a process once of donating, selling her eggs, and gets from 2,000 to 3,000 euros, which is, I think, about 5,000 Canadian dollars, more or less. But of course, nobody discusses the dangers of inserting hormones in your body, of overproducing, which might make your fallopian tubes explode. A lot of, you know, of difficulties. So-called egg donation, again, is a way to hack a system that does not provide equal access, nor for work, nor for care. And what I mean by that is that a migrant subjectivity is basically hacking, is finding a way of quick money, to put it this way, which is again zero flex, no security, no nothing money, in order to hack the system and get a piece of the work/care pie, if we call it like that. So female migrant women make themselves extractable commodities and 0-hour or flex workers simultaneously. I mean, this is for me is extremely interesting in relationship to, let's say, more classical theories of feminist Marxism. It's important here to think of extraction as a process because it relates also to the way governments choose to extract from nature in the various locations of the so-called global south, where extraction of minerals, for instance, feeds the disaster capitalism of the so-called north, global north. So looking at egg donation, one observes an intersectional pattern of inequalities emerging. Women that are migrants, that are jobless or with flex work and that possibly are racialized are the ones participating in the production of prime matter for IVF processes. And especially when it comes to LGBTQI plus couples, how do these migrant female workers mobilize their reproductive capacity? And it's interesting here to see how, let's say, you know, for me, always disaster capitalism is a white straight male somehow, right? So how this normalized idea always pits against one another all those of us that don't belong to the category of the white cis male. And for me, this is quite interesting as well, because it also forces us to pose these questions like, how do these migrant female workers mobilize their reproductive capacity? What are the demand and supply binaries in relationship to their phenotype, for instance, but also their time? You know, do they have time? Also their care labor for others. You know, their time away, let's say, from caring from others. So care for the migrant workers come commodity, and the way their lives are structured to accommodate the demands of a market in one is quite an important aspect of my research now. I'm really thinking about that, but I'm thinking about it in terms also of what these women represent. And they represent a concept that has been very conflicting. One moment. Before I disappear from your screens, I need to plug in my computer. Sorry. So because they do represent something that has been very conflicting also for me. And it is the concept of motherhood and the idea of the mother as a concept and as a social construct that we also in feminist theory have been really struggling with. Because we can't, you know, we can't overcome it somehow. We can discuss about that at the end. So Yes. This question in terms of their lives and how they're structured to accommodate the demands of a market um, makes one think also of how our lives are structured, in what ways and what extent we are transferring care to others in order for us to care for other things or other humans or other non-humans or other than humans, if you want to call it like that, and how this vicious circle is becoming bigger and bigger. Now, one aspect of this transference, again, it is one of these lines in my research, this idea of transference. One radical aspect is human milk factories. And again, this is my second, let's say, paradigm in relationship to reproductive labor in times of ecological catastrophe. Now, the usage of other women's milk in order to feed one's child is not something new. Over the last few decades, the demand for breast milk has grown. The message breast is best has driven, of course, parents and carers all over the world to buy breast milk lately in an effort to care as best they can for their offsprings. In the industry of self-care, and this is the spooky part, which is self-care is something that I've also analyzed in previous papers a lot. Clean eating and bodybuilding, for instance, are two sectors that are in much demand of human milk. Yeah, spooky. According to an artist friend, at this very moment, there is cheese being produced from human milk and sold in hipster Sunday markets somewhere in San Francisco. So, breast milk, that most ancient and fundamental of nourishments, is becoming an industrial commodity and one of the newest frontiers of the biotechnology industry, even as concerns are, of course, many in relationship to this very, very fast growing business with alarming numbers of revenue. Now, it's very interesting to see, of course, that this mentality of the colonial machine come disaster capitalist machine is not new. The sharing of breast milk was something that you could see in small, let's say, collectivist societies. But of course, the appropriation of breast milk has been something that is not new. And here's a drawing of a wet nurse from the period of the US Civil War. And it's interesting to see how the needs to, let's say, satisfy your child overcame the racist mentality of the American South at the time. There were hordes and thousands of women of color, of Afro-Americans that were feeding white babies, nourishing white babies, and leaving their own children undernourished, in fact, because they were forced to do so. So it's not just, let's say, something that the working classes did for the upper classes. It's also very much a racial question. It has been observed from serfdom and slavery times to today. And I would say before this expansion of this business, it was limited to milk banks and peer-to-peer sharing. So there were maybe moments or paradigms, I'm sure, throughout time, where we could even think of this as let's say, a collective sharing of a structure of a commodity, and we could think that this is very democratic. But I would say that this was a very small part of appropriation of a fluid that is coming from a woman's body. Now, there is a very famous company. It's called Prolacta Bioscience, is one of the first companies to distribute and sell human milk. It has been receiving from Silicon Valley more than $50 million in investment. And its chief executive calls milk the white plasma. So it's interesting. He's comparing milk to blood plasma, which has long been collected from people also to save lives. And again, there is this idea of donation that comes to mind, that it is somehow that these women are giving because they're so selfless and they want to contribute to humanity, that they're giving their milk. Of course, they're not giving their milk. Companies are producing a range of breast milk products around the globe, from India to Cambodia to the US and England. And I have to say, an interesting thing that occurred in Cambodia was that recently, I think it was 4 years ago, before the pandemic, it banned the export of human milk, stating through official channels that although Cambodia is a poor and country and life is difficult, we are not at the level that we will sell breast milk from mothers. Now, the statement followed, as I said, a ban, especially for a Utah-based company called Ambrosia Labs that was importing in massive quantities milk from Cambodia, human milk from Cambodia, and selling it for $20 for a 150 ml pack. And for those that don't have children, 150 mLs is not even one meal for a 3-month baby. It's more or less one meal, and they usually need 7 of those. So you can also multiply and calculate how much is that. What is very interesting, of course, is how much money are these women paid in the global, again, the so-called global south, and how much money do these companies make. So these products also, I mean, it's a variety of products. I'm not going to go into it, but they're marketed as safer, vegan, better for the immune system, better for the environment, better for the child. Sometimes, of course, in the case specifically when it comes to replacement, they're marketed as better than formula, trying to kind of break a new market of let's say, parents not using formula milk, but using human milk. So academic research, I had the pleasure of being in a lecture of an academic from an academic group, actually from the UK, that has been conducting interviews with women to have, let's say, first account oral testimony in relationship to what is happening. They were revealing that women overproduce milk in order to facilitate the demand of the market in such ways that they obstruct their everyday life and attention from their family and work for those that have employment, because some of them did not. So it's interesting to see that just as in the case of the oocytes selling, the egg selling, here as well, it is a specific profile of women that are the providers and workers simultaneously of human milk. And it's always women from the working class. It's mostly women of color aiming to add to their incomes. As humans alter landscapes and replace forests with new urban developments, diseases increasingly, this is already mentioned, I think that was the last, diseases increasingly spread from animals to humans, crossing historically self-contained categories. They're inherently connected to these patterns of urbanization, causing the exhaustion of our bodies and of our planet. So I think the COVID pandemic and the questions that relate to care have taught us that vulnerability is now a new point of departure. And instead of actually thinking of how to, extract from the most vulnerable, I think it would be wise for most, if not all of us, to really focus on our own vulnerabilities as a species. So I have been looking into examples of collectives that, of course, are addressing and discussing not only the collapse of care as a framework under which we can think and be and live, but also ways to form counter structures. And many I have already presented in previous lectures and papers. My native Greece has been known for infrastructures that are formed by civil society and that overcome the ongoing financial crisis. I think I will just speak very briefly of 𝓌𝒽𝒶𝓉, which is an incredible example. I always want to give this example. of a collective care paradigm. It's an organization basically that was created by someone that was completely disenfranchised for many, many years and was living almost in the streets. Just before the big crisis, he lost his job. He didn't have any infrastructure support. And one day he basically realized, whilst begging in an open market to try to get food, that he might actually try to get some food from some people and cook this food with the leftovers of what was not sold in the market, and then start sharing the food. And now it's a massive collective of about 80 people that have been going all over the country, but also to other countries. They were there for 3 months during the earthquakes in Turkey, basically just cooking food and providing food to people. So all this has really inspired me to think of this relationship, as I said, of extraction and appropriation with also transference, and the way, just to bring it now in relationship. I mean, I don't know how I am with time, Annie. Okay, because it's,
I think we are good.
okay, I'll wrap it up because it's almost an hour. But I'll talk about the fun stuff now. Well, fun in quotation marks in relationship to institutions. So, I mean, you know, if we're being very honest here, the realm of the art world is it's a very much an extractive realm. I mean, we are an ecology where there are a lot of I tend to say, you know, I don't know how you call it in English, is these animals that are carnivores and are basically eating everything. It's a specific kind of category, and I think this has to do very much with the way that we are in the art world, when it comes from ideas, when it comes to labor, when it comes to many, many things. On parallel to that, and how, you know, structurally unfair the art world is, we also have to think that there is a lot of self-exploitation, there is a lot of self-exhaustion, there is a lot of you know, harm being done to ourselves, not only to others. So I think that we should begin from that when we're discussing care, to actually look at, let's say, the forest and not just several of the trees, when it comes to the way that we understand and we perform instituting, and how we want to build institutions. There are many basic fundamentals that are very interesting for me now, specifically after also 2.5 years of a pandemic, when we're back into the normal, let's say, and we can meet up and we can gather and we can discuss. It has to do really with the structures that have been built and have been established many, many years before we arrived where we are, and that really needs to be dismantled. And that's why I'm talking about not just institutional critique, but institutional transformation. And I'm not even sure anymore that it is transformation, if I'm being honest, because it really, I think there is a need for dismantling here. And why am I looking into this concept of the mother? I am looking into this concept of the mother because for me it's extremely interesting, because we're talking about mother institutions, we're talking about mother galleries, we're talking about the mother of all exhibitions, that is Documenta, for instance. And we have seen what happened in the last edition of Documenta, where basically racism was, you know, kind of thrown up everything all over this exhibition, and left the curators completely unprotected. And I think it's not unrelated, this idea of mothering when it comes to the art world, and especially since the mother is also a figure of power. It's quite interesting for me to look at it as the mother institution, specifically that, like the mother figure of an institution. So what would be, let's say, an exemplary mother in relationship to instituting? That would be very interesting to think about, and this is where I'm going now in terms of my research. And I think that also because there is this conundrum in relationship to to feminist theory and how we understand motherhood, and whether we want to talk about motherhood or parenthood, you know, and our bodies and what our bodies can do, and femininities, and women X, and etc., etc. Now that we're basically reconfiguring, let's say, our worlds in a more egalitarian and say genderless, if you allow me, at least that is my hope, worlds, then I think we should also apply that somehow in the ways that we're instituting. And the way to do that, I really think, is this dismantling of previous infrastructures and ideas. And it's, I mean, in previous essays, I have somehow proposed of how would it be if institutions, for instance, were considering circular movements in relationship to power structures rather than top-down structures. There are some institutions and friends actually that are running institutions that have been trying these experiments of mine, and I hope that they will come with great and valuable feedback in relationship to them. Casco in the Netherlands is one small-scale institution that is trying to do that. The director is not a director now, is becoming a cashier, and the cashier is becoming a director, and they're circulating power. I think if this is maybe a radical thought, let's say, that is not very easily applicable, then maybe we can think of the pre-existing structures and really start from the basics. As I previously mentioned, who are the people that compose the institution? I think these are extremely important questions. Where do they come from? They have arrived in the institution from where? How is it that they have arrived within these four walls? These should be questions that should be interesting for us. And, you know, how do they feel in these walls of the institution? And I know that maybe these questions are considered a little bit new age, like how do they feel? But it is important in order for us to understand how the institutions work. I don't think that otherwise we can really understand how institutions work if we don't start kind of discussing a little bit more how structures influence the way that we live together within these four walls of the institution. I think that is one thing. And in relationship also to climate catastrophe and the fact that we are basically already defutured, I think it's quite important to also go back into very basic questions in relationship to our carbon footprint, whether we recycle, how much we recycle, can we recycle. I know I've spoken to a lot of institutional leaders these last 4 years, and many tell me, yes, but it's not possible to send a catalog to a collector or a benefactor or an artist and the envelope to be old. And I tell them, no, absolutely, you can do that. And you can also make a note and say, we're only recycling our envelope. So you're not going to be getting any crisp white envelope from us, because that's how it is. It might even be a shopping bag that will come with your book that, we just wrapped it, or unless it's plastic. So plastic, no. It's very small things, but very small things, a lot of very small things make institutions much less polluting. And I think another big question in relationship also to social justice in conjunction with environmental justice is how we appropriate and what it is that we appropriate. Because again, talking about the mother institutions or the bigger institutional figure towards smaller institutional or more precarious institutional figures, I think this is another very important thing that we're not thinking about and not talking about openly enough. And that is how, big institutions are bad mummies that are basically stealing everything from smaller institutions without mothering the smaller institutions or taking care of the smaller institutions. And this is something that we've noticed a lot in many ecologies, from peripheral, let's say, European ecologies, Albania or Greece, to the core, let's say, centers of the art world, New York or London or what have you, where you see that, there is the information of what a smaller institution is producing, and then the bigger institution is like comes in and basically just sucks everything out of the life of the smaller institution. Of course, there you have the danger of an incredibly radical programming becoming something very, very, I don't know, meh, for a lack of a better word. But this is a phenomenon, and there is no credit due there. And I think this is a massive problem. I think that bigger institutions should be more generous and should be more like a selfless mother, if we would like to use this prototype, rather than a mean mommy. So I think these are questions that we're thinking about at the moment. And just to sum it up a little bit in terms of the Bureau of Care as well, we have been discussing a lot with non-artistic structures, mainly activist structures. And there is where we try to learn without appropriating also. We're basically trying to think together with them and say, okay, you only have structural forms of power that circulate. Power is temporary and it's movable. Fantastic. Would it be possible to do that in an art institution? Would it be possible to do it in a big art institution? Would it be possible to do it in a smaller art institution? And maybe things that work for activist or civic society structures totally don't work for an art institution, maybe, or maybe yes. But it's very interesting to think outside of our comfort zones, I think. And art institutions, be it something like, let's say, you guys, that you've started as an artist initiative, if I'm not mistaken, a collective artist initiative, or be it, let's say, a big state museum that was funded by, I don't know, President, Prime Minister X. I think it doesn't matter. I think what matters is that institutions also understand their vulnerabilities and think of care as a way of being and as a way of regrouping and as a way of transforming. And I think I'm going to stop here. Let me just, how do you stop the sharing?
The little Zoom dance.
Okay, there we are. Stop
Okay,
sharing.
great. Yeah, you've posed so many interesting questions, and there were so many trajectories in your lecture that I'm just going to remove the spotlight here that I want to touch upon. Your research is very fascinating. I'm trying to figure out where to begin. The comment about larger institutions, we have a really interesting culture here. We have something called 𝒸𝓶, where we are able to actually categorize the different sizes of our structures from category 1, 2, and 3. And these categories are based on operating funding. And so it's quite interesting. Like us, we're at Gallery TPW, we're a category 1, so we're a smaller, which is like the smallest of the category, and receives something like the least funding, again, across the councils. And so, yeah, what's interesting is to think about how to bridge these relationships across larger and smaller institutions. And the metaphor of mothering is really interesting. And I also want to offer like the metaphors of collectivity, and to, bring up maybe a cliche term that it takes a village to raise a child. It really takes so many, and we've learned through many of the conversations yesterday, it really takes many partnerships, many people to come together, and so much time in trust building, because we have small institutions and also artists have experienced much violence from these larger bodies. So yeah, it's very interesting to hear the research and the thoughts coming from over there. Yeah, I have a lot of ideas.
Just to make a short comment in what you said, I think there's in terms of the violence, of course, there's the structural violence that comes with these kind of also, not always only, but of course, I would say traditionally, these older structures that are more rigid, but also the racism that permeates, everything. Again, the art world was not a fantastically democratic place to be in 60, 70 years ago. So it's kind of slowly democratizing itself, and but it hasn't yet. And it has been something that, again, I've written about it extensively, and I'm becoming a little bit too radical at times, but I really feel that the concept of culture itself, and to be cultured and to be cultivated, was very much a white concept. So it has been very hostile to anything that kind of falls out of that category of this kind of middle or upper class white individual that would go into the museum. Back in the old days in the European museums, you needed an invitation by a lord or a count or whatever it was that they had back there in order to get into a museum even. So I think this it's important to always think of that and not forget it in relationship also to the ways that they are structured and the ways that one is forced, let's say, maybe it's too strong of a word, one is conditioned to behave within an institution. And I think the fact that there have been so many struggles the last 40 years, and rightfully so, have tried to break these constrictions and these racism and these kind of boxes that exist for us all to go in and squeeze oneself next to the other. But there's still a lot of work to be done in terms of that, I think. One other thing that a lot of people choose not to talk about is that if you want to change the structures of power, you also need to relinquish a little bit of your own power. There are a lot of people that are accommodating diversity. Again, I'll put it, the word that everybody talks about, but they're very unwilling to step down and to allow for others to take power. So, benevolent benevolent rulers, I say also as well, because we still have a lot of these kind of figures in the art world that they're very kind of inviting, to everyone that is, not white and not male and not, but they are not very willing to say, okay, now I had my time, now it's time for others as well. So I think we should also start from that. That's why I'm saying kind of an introspection as well for institutions to see, which doesn't really happen. It's a lot of extraction and a lot of how to say it. What is important now, a lot of woke culture that happens, and you see it in very big museums, that we have to do this, we have to do that, and they do it and they kind of tick the boxes, but then the structures themselves produce the violence that you were talking about. So it's kind of a problem.
Yeah, the co-option and the performativity of a type of like inclusivity can be also just as violent if it isn't filtered into the structural changes of the institution. And we've had a lot of conversations here because we are kind of at Gallery TPW, kind of relatively new staff, and we've been thinking about what a type of horizontality would mean. We've been questioning the types of hoardings of power. And earlier, yesterday in our Tuesday, our keynote really mentioned something quite beautiful and said like care is memory. And so at the same time, while we value these elders who operate and have worked and dedicated themselves to the community and to building art structures that advocate for more equitable distributions of resources, like how can we also imagine a more horizontal way of being in relation? And it does take a radical leap of trust. It does take a radical release of power, which can be kind of hard. Yeah. And I want to get back to something that you mentioned earlier in the sort of the introductory part of your your lecture in thinking about disaster capitalism and how the pandemic has sort of exposed these, at one time, the sort of potential of what uh, what uh, what a crisis can provide. Like, for example, here in Canada, there was for a very short time a basic income. There was for a very short time free healthcare for those who were undocumented, for those who are refugees or didn't have the sort of
Just,
papers.
if I may ask, what is the
Mm.
healthcare system in Canada? Is it privatized completely? Is it like the US system, or do you have state welfare?
We have some state welfare health services, but some of it is limited, and much of it is limited to those who are not citizens or who have that kind of proper documentation. And so what was really interesting was during the pandemic, anyone could access the healthcare system for this time, for this period. And just last month, the government
Stopped it.
redacted that services. And so, you know, it's interesting to think about how there's a production of precarity because we know that these resources actually are available and can be available.
No,
And at the same, and I think at the same time, what is really interesting is what we saw was we were leaning on these models of care and these really radical structures during the crisis that were already established by marginalized communities. And yesterday, and Jillian Diego mentioned that the emergence of pods, and so during the pandemic, we all had to pod and be in, well, we all remember what pods were. And this sort of, this podding actually came from, or was already in practice during the AIDS pandemic, where people who were suffering from AIDS podded with people. And so we've learned to, so these sort of technologies or these sort of methods of cares were already kind of existing. And yet when given the resources and practice sort of on a mainstream level, it can actually show how we can all sort of survive. And so, yeah, I guess, you know,
I mean, this is
listening.
another question there, though, of course, also. I mean, I've used the AIDS pandemic as well in previous texts, and especially the way that patients themselves organized in order to also find not cure, we can't say it cure, but in any case to kind of formulate protocols of medicine back in the day, and also providing care for one another, having kind of care groups, having almost like battalions that went from one flat to the next in order to help those that were not able to care for themselves anymore. And I think that is very important. And it's always also important to understand the legacies of that, and the legacies that precede that, and the legacies that precede that of that, etc., etc. I mean, what you said in terms of memory, I think it kind of fits also here. It's very important to understand and to honor systems of care structures that are collective systems of care structures that came and of course, I mean, from First Nations and Indigenous people for and foremost, because they still have these histories transferred into the knowledges of today. As a philosophy of life. So I think it's important to think of that in relationship also to how it has transported into political movements, be it the AIDS movement, the LGBTI movement in relationship to the AIDS pandemic, be it a country in crisis that has no infrastructures because it's a failed state where people have it, or be it that also, again, civil society sometimes forces governments today to step up, like it has in many cases in the COVID pandemic. But the thing is that it's as if we're kind of recognizing a common alphabet in relationship to the language of care, and I think that this is very, very, very important. highlight constantly.
Yeah, I wonder, I'm interested also in the very slippery slope when care ethics becomes monetized and capitalized to a point where it's a biopolitics of control of bodies, especially in your research with the egg donors. I find, very
Well,
kind of tricky.
I mean, again, I'm delving now into this whole system, and I'm not only interested actually in egg donation. I'm also interested in sperm donation, but I haven't gone to that side yet at all. So watch out for my next essay on it.
Yeah.
Because again, I don't want to kind of only focus on on femininities. I would also like to focus on other things. But donation, the concept of donation for me is interesting. That is not donation, is a market, but the fact that you're producing something that basically allows for reproductive labor to produce new workers. This is, I mean, it basically goes back to the concept of Federici in terms of how female reproductive labor also ensures our future somehow, the future workers. There will be, we produce future bodies for the capitalist machine to abuse. So for me, that is very interesting as an idea. But I think also the dangers of that in relationship to what you mentioned, the biopolitics of control, because if one kind of delves into the ways that there is a selection in terms of who can give eggs, who can give sperm, in many countries of the global north, anyone that has, for instance, in their family history, mentally differently abled persons cannot give sperm, for example, or an egg. It's not, I said many, it's not many, it's some, let's say, countries from the north that I know from academic papers that are researching that. That is a problem. Or if one wants only blue-eyed people, then we're going into directions that are very scary and are reminiscent of eugenics and other very problematic histories of complete violence and darkness.
Yeah, I have many thoughts on that, and particularly interested in the industry that has emerged from egg donations, because it is, especially when there are language barriers, there's become a very kind of threatening management that evolves. Whenever there's a need, there's also a way of exploitation. And I'm also very aware of time, and I know there are many people who would like to ask questions. So I turn it over now to the chat. If anyone has any questions in the audience, please share them either in the Q&A or in the chat. Or if you are on site, I think Netta is available to type your question into the chat. Okay, we have a question from Lisa. Can you talk a bit more in detail about circular power structures? Can you give an example of an experiment in this area?
Yes, I think I mentioned it. It's 𝒶𝓉. It's an art institution in Utrecht in the Netherlands, where I'm partially based, where they have started doing it. But when we're talking about that in terms of already being tested and tried and being successful, we can talk about the School of Migrants in Piraeus, which is the port city near Athens, with which we've worked with. And they have been doing that successfully for almost a decade now. But that doesn't mean that there is no organization, because a lot of people say, oh yeah, structural power, you know, everybody does what they want. No, 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 no. There's a lot, there's a lot of organization, very kind of, you know, rigid organization skills that are needed there in order for this to work. So there are like these Excel sheets that are shared. There are like reminders that are sent by those that have the facility of the, you know, of the secretary for the period, the X period of time, etc., etc., in order for people to keep up with their tasks. And the decisions are made collectively when it comes to big decisions. So they have assemblies where, for instance, they decide, I'll just give you a real example that I know of. Rich guy from Athens wants to donate money to the open school for migrants. They can't accept the money unless they have an assembly and they discuss the origin of the money, and they think that, okay, this guy is rich, but he's okay, you know, he's not like a drug dealer, he doesn't sell weapons, he doesn't make money off XXX. So they kind of discuss whether the money is ethical for them, let's say, in a way, and then they accept the donation. Just to give you an example, which is a real example, as I said previously, that I know of, that what they do. Given that, and having said that, and although it really works, there are discussions that we had with the Open School of Migrants where they express the fact that many times when people don't do their tasks, other people, because of the goodness of their hearts or because of their feeling of responsibility, take up these tasks and perform these tasks. And they said that many times that they have had that in the past. It occurs often, let's say, and this has posed a problem of lack of self-care, because a lot of the volunteers, because the majority are volunteers, are also overworked. And there is a lack of self-care. And what happens there? But you know, there is no answer to that, because they're saying that we really much prefer this system than actually having a top-down system, where there will be other forms of rigidity and you know, lack of care for a lot of things, and they think it would be worse, so they prefer to kind of maybe overwork themselves a little bit. It remains to be seen what is the right. I'm not answering that, but
Yeah, I feel like that even in traditional structures, I feel like the burnout is real. Can sometimes collapse collectives. And this actually is a very interesting question that follows up to it. This is by 𝒸𝒶𝓉. Thank you so much, 𝓌𝒼ana, for your amazing lecture. It is very inspiring for me, who is an emerging artist curator from 𝒸𝒶𝓇𝑒 graduate study. My thesis also has a focus on self-care in relation to the totalitarian state and the government. I guess sometimes thinking as an individual, I and the people around me feel almost helpless to have the time and energy to care for ourselves, to stand for ourselves, because of how the state has made self-care our own responsibility and not theirs. And as you had said, self-care, especially healthcare, is expensive at the individual's cost as well. So I guess my question is, thinking both in the individual shoes, what can we do to interfere institutional change? And how the institution can promote this transition themselves in tangible ways. Can you see the question, 𝓌𝒼ana? I can also type it for you.
No,
Okay.
I can't.
Let me
if you just copy paste it in the host and panelists chat. It's two questions, in fact, and thank you so much. They're wonderful questions. So I mean, so the question, I guess, is how can we interfere with this? What can we do to interfere with institutional change as individuals, or to kind of help institutional change? I'm not sure what it is, because it says, what can we do to interfere institutional change? What can we do to kind of redirect, maybe it is that you want to say, institutional change? I'll ask the second one. I'll answer the second one first, and how the institution can promote this transition themselves in tangible ways. I mean, maybe Sissy says, I think both. Okay. So interfere from the individual shoes. I mean, interference, we have so many examples of interference. Again, individual, I'm not sure it's individual in the sense that, I mean, think of, I'll give you the most famous example, and forgive me for giving the famous examples and not more kind of underground examples, but it's also 10 o'clock almost at night here for me, so I'm a little bit, my brain is fried as well. So the most famous example, of course, is Nan Goldin, and the whole trajectory of Nan Goldin when it comes to institutional change, and not only institutional, societal change in relationship to really cutting out from museums murderers, if we're being plain about it, people that really sell, it's like official or like sanitized drug dealers. So I mean, this is an excellent example. Would it be possible if Nan Goldin was not Nan Goldin that we all know? Maybe not. But then we have decolonized this place, just to give examples of the US that you might, be familiar with in terms of geography, because they're closer to you, which is a collective of unknown individuals, and on purpose unknown, because they don't want to be named. Not all of them, some of them are known, that have also managed to create changes in very big and very rigid institutions that have, very rich individuals in their boards that have power, etc., etc. So I think these two examples, because when we're talking about care, and we're discussing care as well in relationship to ethics, I mean, you can't propagate. This is a problem, for instance, in Greece. We're not having at all these discussions, I'm afraid, because we're a little bit backward in terms of these questions. Sorry to say it so bluntly, but we're a little bit kind of in the old days still. When you have, for instance, individuals that are I'll give you a real example from Greece. Shipping magnates that have they have like massive ships that transport oil, right? And they're making exhibitions. They have a foundation, and they're making exhibitions about ecology. Like, I mean, that is laughable, because you're thinking, dude, you're making your money by transporting oil, like extraction, fossil fuel, defuturing of all of us. And suddenly, what are you doing? You're greenwashing basically your activities by, making an exhibition of showing how, climate sensitive you are, or that you are interested in climate justice. The way to change these structures, it's to actually be open and discuss them and confront them. So the interference is a confrontation for me. There are many strategies and ways of how to confront. It can be through the way to colonize this place is doing, by going in the museum, having banners, etc., or Nan Golding's ways. It can also be with other ways. Now, in terms of the individual, it's very difficult for the individual to do it. Even Nan Goldin didn't do it alone. There was a collective behind Nan Goldin of persons that have lost their loved ones to 𝒸𝒶𝓉. So I'm not sure Don Quixote was one man running after the the windmills. He also had a friend. He was not totally alone, but I think it's very difficult. And I think this is also the beauty of it, that collective struggles always are more rewarding to us as well. So I don't know if I answered the question, and how the institution can promote this transition themselves in tangible ways. This is a very excellent question. It's a very difficult question as well, because it's always super difficult for institutions to actually do it in tangible ways, because what they're doing mainly is like doing it on top. It's what my grandmother said, you're not cleaning very well. you're just doing the dust from top, and then all the other drawers are filled with dust because you're lazy and because you are in a rush. So I think a lot of institutions have this, like, just wipe it like quickly like that, and then everything, it looks clean. If it looks clean, it is clean. Yeah. Okay, so no, there is no time, and then many times it's not a lack of time, it's a lack of desire to actually delve into things, because things take time to change, and institutions are not willing to do that, because they have been, especially the big institutions, that are also setting the tone for all the other institutions, the medium and the smaller ones. That's why we're always looking at these big institutions, because they're very important. So I think the big institutions, because of this extreme neoliberalized way of understanding the museum itself as also a machine that makes money, they don't want to waste time when it doesn't profit them, only when they're forced. So changes are being forced because of individuals or a collective of individuals. And when they realize that they're going to be losing money or losing audiences or losing, that's when they're doing change. So the tangible ways, I think, again, they have to do with people. You have to have people with vision. You have to have people with ethics in museums in order for museums to change. And just to kind of ring my bell of doom and gloom here as well a little bit, unfortunately, when you saw in the European Union, at least, or let's say Europe at large, the luxury and the privilege, and I'm using these words on purpose, of institutions that were state funded and could criticize the state and have really radical programming, when you see them diminishing and programming becoming by the book, supposedly, I don't know, progressive, but only by the book, and not really progressive, then I think is something to trouble all of us. Because I know in the US, I'm not sure, I think in Canada it's not the same, but I know that in the US, for instance, and in many institutions in South America, because of private foundations and in general, the culture being privatized in the extent where you are constantly dependent by donors, then it's very difficult to have challenging programming that is actually makes one think a little bit further in relationship to the questions that we're asking. So Europe had one thing that was that was good, and it was that, and this is diminishing now. And this is something that should trouble all of us, because going back to, Roe versus Wade, and I'm sorry that I'm talking too much, but the conservative politics that are related to feminist rights and equality rights are also reflected in the art institutions, because all these conservatives want all us cultural Marxists, they call us, to not exist.
Yeah, the dependency on funding has made it very difficult, and I want to sort of add a resource. I've been reading The Revolution Will Not Be Funded, which talks about the nonprofit industrial complex, and the opening chapter talks about an organization that lost its foundation funding because of its advocacy and its activism. So yeah, that's a sort of interesting text also that helps navigate those questions. And we have an exciting question from somebody who's at the gallery right now. And then perhaps, I'm very also wary of your time, and it's getting late. I can see visibly it's getting darker in your room. So maybe this can be the last question. This is from Danica. You've spoken so insightfully about medical and art institutions. Are there other industries you find hope or inspiration in? Public libraries come to mind, but I'm curious if any other sectors have informed your thinking of care. Thank you for this talk.
Oh, thank you for this question. It's now a question that makes me think. Well, I mean, the Bureau of Care, which was the let's say initial, it's still basically the platform, the research platform under which we're all working towards these questions. has been looking into activist and civil society circles in order to answer these questions that relate to instituting. And all these initiatives are initiatives that are not necessarily linked to one another. So they're not initiatives that are related to the medical profession, and they're not initiatives that are related to the art profession. They're initiatives that are related to disability justice. They're initiatives that are related to migrant rights. They're initiatives that are related to rent justice, can we call it like that? Or let's say housing justice, etc., etc. So there are many different industries, and in quotation marks, if we can call them like that, or let's say sectors of work that we're inspired from. But public libraries never. And thank you so much for this, because now I'm going to start thinking about it. Public libraries in Greece are places that you go if you want to die, basically. That's what we say, because they're not very well they're not very well informed. But however, in the Netherlands, I do love public libraries, and when I used to live in the UK, I used to love public libraries. They were a fantastic place to think and be creative and learn. So I will be looking into public libraries. Thank you very much. This is great.
All right. Well, thank you so much, 𝓌𝒽𝒻a. I wish we had more time, but I do look forward to being in proximity and conversation, perhaps in person in the future.
Me
Yeah,
too. It
thank
would
you.
be fantastic. Thank you all very
Yeah.
much. I'm really chuffed with so many people that stayed until the end. So thank you very much, and hope to meet you all one day.
Yeah. Okay. Have a good night.
Bye. Good
And
night.
thank you, everyone. Take care. Bye-bye.